When Clint Eastwood stepped into the airport terminal, no one paid him much attention. Just another traveler, another face in the crowd. But when a flight attendant coldly denied a disabled boy the right to board, turning his mother's desperate pleas into nothing more than an inconvenience, Clint saw everything, and in that moment, the room shifted. Because Clint Eastwood wasn't just watching, he was waiting, and when he finally stood up, the entire terminal held its breath. What happened next wasn't just a confrontation, it became a reckoning, a lesson in respect, justice, and power that no one would ever forget. Lisa Carter adjusted the strap on her shoulder, her bag heavier than she remembered. Airports were always chaotic, but today, the weight she carried wasn't just physical, it was the pressure of making sure everything went smoothly for her son. Beside her, Danny's small hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair. His excitement was evident in the way he bounced slightly, his sneakers tapping against the footrest. "Are you sure we're going to make it on time, Mom?" he asked, his voice filled with both curiosity and a hint of nervousness. Lisa crouched next to him, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "Of course, sweetheart. We're early. No rush at all." She had done everything right. She booked the tickets months in advance, contacted the airline's disability services, and confirmed twice that pre-boarding accommodations were arranged. There was no reason for things to go wrong. Yet, as they approached the TSA checkpoint, Lisa couldn't shake the familiar apprehension. Security was a slow process. The officer asked her to step aside while they patted down Danny and checked his wheelchair. It wasn't the first time they'd gone through this. She watched the people in line glance their way, some with vague impatience, others with quiet curiosity. Danny fidgeted, his excitement dimming slightly. "It's okay, bud," Lisa reassured, forcing a light-hearted tone. Finally, they were cleared. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, one step closer. As they made their way through the terminal, Danny's eyes lit up. Planes taxied outside the giant windows, their engines humming. Families bustled past, some kids tugging on their parents' hands, others pressed against the glass in awe. "I can't believe we're actually flying," Danny whispered, more to himself than to Lisa. She smiled, gripping the handles of his wheelchair. Neither could she. Reaching gate B-17, Lisa spotted the airline's check-in desk, where a uniformed attendant stood by the counter. The worst was behind them, or so she thought. But as they approached the gate, something shifted. Lisa felt it before she saw it. The subtle change in posture, the tension in the air, the way the flight attendant's smile faltered the moment she saw Danny's wheelchair. Lisa's stomach tightened. Something was wrong. The overhead speakers crackled, announcing final boarding calls for other flights, but Lisa barely registered them. She was too focused on the woman standing behind the counter. Nancy, the name tag pinned neatly to her pressed uniform. Nancy's eyes flickered down to Danny's wheelchair for a split second before her expression tightened. Just enough for Lisa to notice. Lisa pushed forward, staying polite. Always polite. "Hi," she said, sliding over their documents. "We're on Flight 278 to Denver. We have pre-approved boarding accommodations." She had barely finished speaking before Nancy snatched the paperwork, flipping through it with brisk efficiency. Her lips pursed, her brow furrowed. Lisa knew this look. It wasn't confusion, it was skepticism. Danny, unaware of the unspoken shift, beamed up at Nancy. "I'm so excited. It's my first time flying." Nancy barely glanced at him. Lisa's grip on the wheelchair handles tightened. "Everything should be in order," she added, her voice steady. Nancy sighed, a slow, exasperated breath, then looked up. One moment. She turned without another word, disappearing into the small staff area behind the counter. Lisa exhaled sharply, trying to ignore the prickling sensation crawling up her spine. Danny tilted his head back. "What's wrong?" Lisa forced a smile. "Nothing, sweetie, just a quick check." But it wasn't nothing. She could feel the unspoken tension around them. Passengers lining up for boarding shot them sideways glances, some curious, others indifferent. A businessman in a suit muttered under his breath, checking his watch. Lisa ignored them. Minutes ticked by. Nancy finally returned, but her expression wasn't reassuring. It had hardened. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice clipped, "but we can't accommodate wheelchairs on this flight." Lisa blinked. For a moment, the words didn't register. "What?" Her voice came out quieter than she intended. Nancy folded her arms as if preparing for resistance. "It's policy. Our aircraft isn't equipped for—" Lisa's pulse pounded. "That's not true. I confirmed with your disability services twice. Our seats are booked. We—" Nancy cut her off with a tight smile. "I'm sorry," she repeated flatly. Lisa glanced at Danny. He was watching, wide-eyed, gripping the armrests of his chair. He understood. Lisa felt a heat rise in her chest. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was something else entirely. And suddenly, the entire airport terminal felt a lot colder. Lisa's breath hitched, her fingers tightening around the handles of Danny's wheelchair. Nancy's words hung in the air, cold and absolute. "I'm sorry, but we can't accommodate wheelchairs on this flight." Lisa stared, trying to process what she had just heard. This couldn't be happening. I don't understand," Lisa said, her voice measured but firm. "I called, I confirmed, twice. Your airline's disability services told me we'd be accommodated." Nancy's lips pressed into a thin, unimpressed line. She shook her head, her expression a careful mask of indifference. "There must be a misunderstanding," Lisa insisted. "We booked our seats months ago. We followed every instruction." Nancy sighed as if Lisa were being difficult. "There was a recent policy change," she said, as if that explained everything. "Unfortunately, that means—" Lisa cut her off. "No one told us about a policy change," she snapped, feeling the heat rise in her chest. "Why wasn't I notified?" Nancy's gaze flickered to Danny, then quickly away. "These changes happen," she said dismissively. "I don't make the rules." Lisa opened her mouth to argue, but movement around her caught her attention. Passengers were starting to notice the exchange. A woman holding a coffee cup paused mid-sip, her gaze darting between Lisa and Nancy. A man adjusting his backpack frowned slightly, leaning just a little closer. A couple near the window whispered to each other, eyes shifting toward Danny's wheelchair. The tension was shifting, thickening. Lisa felt the weight of the stares. She wasn't sure if they were curious, sympathetic, or just impatient. Danny stayed silent, his fingers now curled into the fabric of his jeans. He could tell something was wrong. He could always tell. Lisa took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Let me speak to a supervisor," she said, her voice sharp but controlled. Nancy didn't even blink. "There's no one available right now," she said. Lisa clenched her jaw. She knew a brick wall when she saw one, but she wasn't about to let it stop her. Lisa leaned forward slightly, her pulse hammering in her ears. "Listen," she said, her voice lower now, more urgent. "My son has every right to be on this flight. We did everything we were supposed to. You don't get to just—" Nancy tilted her head, that practiced customer service smile returning. "I understand, ma'am," she said smoothly, but she didn't, not really. Lisa felt the shift, the way Nancy was trying to make her feel unreasonable, like she was the problem. "There's just nothing I can do," Nancy continued, that same tired script, that same forced patience. Lisa exhaled sharply, frustration bubbling over. "Nothing you can do?" she repeated. "Or nothing you want to do?" Nancy stiffened just slightly. A nearby businessman let out an exaggerated sigh, loudly flipping through a newspaper. "Here we go again," he muttered, holding up the line. Lisa's stomach knotted. Danny shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Lisa saw it, the way his shoulders hunched slightly, the way his fingers gripped the wheels of his chair just a little tighter. He was embarrassed. He felt like a burden. Lisa's heart clenched. She knelt beside him, placing a hand over his. "Sweetheart, this isn't your fault, okay?" Danny didn't look at her. Nancy let out another pointed sigh, tapping her nails against the counter. "Ma'am, if you don't step aside, I'll have to ask security to assist." Lisa's head snapped up. Nancy was done pretending to be patient. Passengers started whispering, the unease in the air thickening. Lisa could hear it, some murmurs soft with sympathy, others dripping with irritation. But no one stepped forward, not yet. Lisa squared her shoulders, her jaw tightening. Danny's eyes glistened, his chest rising and falling a little too fast. Lisa would not let this happen. She wouldn't let her son be humiliated like this. She took a breath. And then, from across the terminal, a man lowered his newspaper and stood up. Lisa felt her throat tighten, the frustration and exhaustion pressing against her chest. She had been here before. Different city, different people, same quiet humiliation. And yet, this time, felt different. Because this time, someone else was watching. From the priority seating area near the gate, a man slowly lowered his newspaper. The movement was unhurried, deliberate, like a man who had seen this kind of thing before. The paper folded neatly, revealing steely blue eyes beneath furrowed brows. Weathered, but sharp. A face that carried the weight of 1,000 stories. Clint Eastwood. Dressed in a simple jacket and jeans, his presence alone carried more weight than any uniform in the room. He didn't move right away, he just watched. Nancy, oblivious to the shift in the air, continued tapping at her keyboard like Lisa was nothing more than an inconvenience. Lisa opened her mouth to argue again, but she sensed it. The energy in the room was changing. Passengers were looking away from their phones, their books, their quiet conversations, because Clint had stood up. The way he did it was almost too calm. No dramatic gestures, no rush. Just a man getting to his feet with the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Nancy still hadn't noticed, but the rest of the terminal had. Murmurs started, rippling through the crowd. Lisa didn't dare turn around, but she felt it happening. People weren't just watching anymore. They were waiting. Clint took one step forward, then another. His boots echoed against the polished floor, slow and methodical. A young man near the gate elbowed his friend, whispering, "Holy crap, that's Clint Eastwood." A woman gripping her coffee paused mid-sip, eyes locked on him. Someone else whispered, "Is he about to say something?" Nancy, still oblivious, let out an exaggerated sigh and looked back at Lisa. "Ma'am, I've already explained." She stopped, because Clint Eastwood was standing right in front of her, and the moment he spoke, the entire airport went still. Clint Eastwood didn't say a word at first. He didn't have to. His presence alone cut through the noise, commanding the attention of every person in the gate area. Nancy visibly stiffened, her earlier smugness replaced with unease. For a long, agonizing moment, he just stared at her. His hands rested against the counter, his expression unreadable. Lisa swallowed hard, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Nancy's fingers twitched on the keyboard. She cleared her throat, forced a smile. "Sir, can I help you?" The question sounded ridiculous, like she didn't already know exactly why he was standing there. Clint exhaled through his nose, slow and measured. Then, in that voice, the one that had made grown men rethink their choices for decades, he spoke. "Ma'am, are you seriously telling me that an 8-year-old kid can't get on this plane because he's in a wheelchair?" Nancy opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She was caught, trapped under the weight of his gaze. Passengers held their breath, their eyes bouncing between Nancy and Clint like this was some kind of showdown. Lisa didn't move. Danny, wide-eyed, gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, sensing that something important was happening. Nancy tried to recover. "Sir, I was just following protocol." Clint's eyes narrowed just slightly. "Protocol?" he repeated, the word dripping with disbelief. Nancy swallowed hard. Lisa watched as the confidence drained from her face, replaced by something else. something closer to fear. Because Clint wasn't just some frustrated customer, he was Clint Eastwood. And when he stood up against something, people listened. The air grew heavier. No one spoke. No one moved. It was a silence that demanded the right answer, and Nancy didn't have one. The silence in the terminal was deafening. Nancy's face tightened, but her fingers twitched, like she was searching for an answer that wasn't there. Clint Eastwood's gaze never wavered. His hands remained steady on the counter, his expression carved from stone. And then he spoke, softly, firmly. But the force behind his words could have split the room in half. "Ma'am, are you seriously telling me that an 8-year-old kid can't get on this plane because he's in a wheelchair?" Nancy's breath hitched. For the first time since this whole exchange began, she hesitated. Lisa saw it, the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Danny sat frozen in his chair, his fingers curling over the fabric of his pants, his small body stiff with confusion. The entire gate area held its breath. Nancy opened her mouth, but her voice was just a fraction weaker than before. "Sir, it's company policy, and I'm just following—" Clint's jaw tensed, his eyes narrowed, and then he cut her off. "I've seen a lot of cowards hide behind policy before." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Every syllable landed like a hammer on stone. A man a few seats away slowly lowered his coffee cup. A woman near the window let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Nancy's throat bobbed in a nervous swallow. Clint leaned in just slightly, his presence towering over her. It never ends well. The air grew thick with something unspoken. For the first time, Lisa saw it, doubt creeping into Nancy's expression. Nancy's gaze flickered to the growing crowd behind Clint. People weren't just watching anymore, they were waiting. Nancy shifted her weight from one foot to the other, but her once confident stance was crumbling beneath her. She knew it, everyone knew it. And Clint Eastwood, he was just getting started. A sudden shuffle of movement near the back of the gate area. A man in a navy blue suit rushed forward, his airport ID bouncing against his chest as he walked. The gate supervisor. Nancy visibly exhaled as he stepped beside her. Finally, her backup had arrived. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice trying to sound authoritative, but falling flat under the weight of the moment. Clint didn't answer him. Instead, he stepped aside, turning toward Danny. And then, in a voice that was calm but undeniable, he gestured toward the boy and spoke. "You tell this kid," Clint's finger pointed, slow and deliberate, "that he doesn't deserve to board this plane like everybody else." The supervisor stammered, caught off guard. Nancy visibly tensed, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. Lisa's breath hitched. Danny's eyes darted up to the man in the suit, his small face filled with confusion. And for the first time, true hesitation crossed the supervisor's face. A nearby passenger raised their phone, hitting record. The red light blinked, capturing every second. The gate agent at the next counter, who had been pretending not to notice the commotion, stole a quick glance at her co-worker. Nancy felt the shift. This wasn't just an argument anymore. This was a moment where she no longer had control. Because now the world was watching. A woman near the front of the boarding area spoke up first. Her voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is ridiculous. Let the boy board." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Another voice, this time a man in his 40s, shaking his head. "You can't just deny a kid a seat because he's in a wheelchair." The businessman who had sighed impatiently before, even he looked uncomfortable now. Nancy's jaw tightened. The supervisor shifted uneasily, glancing from Clint to Lisa to the restless crowd. Danny's fingers curled over the arms of his wheelchair. And then, quietly but clearly, he asked, "Did I do something wrong?" Lisa's heart shattered. Her hands tightened on the back of his chair, fighting the sting behind her eyes. Nancy looked away. The supervisor ran a hand over his mouth, clearly aware that he was standing on thin ice. Clint, he was still watching, still waiting. for someone, anyone, to make the right call. The weight of silence in the terminal was unbearable. Nancy's face had gone pale, her fingers still clutching the keyboard, as if it were a lifeline. The gate supervisor, shifting from foot to foot, rubbed the back of his neck, eyes darting from Clint to Danny to the growing crowd of restless passengers. And then, as if a switch had been flipped, he snapped into action. He turned to Lisa, his voice hurried, almost desperate to fix what had unraveled in front of so many witnesses. "I sincerely apologize for this misunderstanding," he said quickly, his words stumbling over themselves. "This should never have happened." Lisa didn't speak, her arms still protectively resting on Danny's wheelchair handles. The supervisor shot a sharp glance at Nancy. "Nancy," he said, his voice tight, "step aside. Now." Nancy opened her mouth, but whatever protest she was about to make died in her throat. She knew she had lost. A uniformed airport staff member approached, speaking to her in hushed tones, leading her toward the back office. Passengers watched her go, some shaking their heads, others whispering among themselves. Nancy's fate was uncertain, but one thing was clear: she would not be handling passengers today. And then finally, the supervisor turned back to Lisa. "We're ready to begin pre-boarding for you and your son," he said. His voice was still rushed, still trying to save face, but the power had shifted. The moment had already belonged to Clint Eastwood. And speaking of Clint, he wasn't done yet. He turned, his boots light against the polished floor, and lowered himself slowly to one knee beside Danny's wheelchair. At eye level now, he rested an elbow on his knee, studying the boy with those famous, steely blue eyes. "You're braver than half the people I've met in my life, kid," he said, his voice low but filled with certainty. Danny's eyes widened, his small hands gripping the armrests of his chair, as if he were memorizing this moment forever. "Never let anyone tell you otherwise," Clint finished. And then he gave Danny a small, respectful nod, the ultimate Eastwood approval. The silence broke all at once. The crowd erupted into applause. Lisa felt a wave of emotion crash over her, her hands trembling slightly on the back of Danny's wheelchair. Passengers clapped, some standing, others just watching in quiet admiration. Danny, stunned, looked up at his mother, his voice barely a whisper. "Did that just happen?" Lisa smiled, blinking away tears. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered back, "it did." And then, finally, they boarded the plane. The cabin was calm, the hum of the engines vibrating beneath them. Lisa carefully buckled Danny's seatbelt, his wheelchair safely stored, as per their originally approved accommodations, like it should have been all along. The flight crew greeted them warmly, offering smiles and extra blankets. Danny's eyes were still wide, his mind replaying what had just happened. Lisa exhaled, finally allowing herself to breathe. As the plane taxied to the runway, she turned her head toward the window, her eyes scanning the terminal. And that's when she saw him, Clint, walking toward his own flight, moving with the same steady, unshaken presence he had carried throughout the entire encounter. No victory lap, no need for applause, just a man who did the right thing because it was the right thing to do. Danny leaned closer to the window, his voice soft but filled with awe. "Mom, that was like a movie." Lisa let out a quiet laugh, squeezing his hand. "Because sometimes, Danny," she said, her voice warm and sure, "real heroes don't wear capes." She gave his hand another squeeze. "They just stand up when it matters." The screen fades to black, and then the final message appears. "If you believe in fairness for all, share this story and spread the message." The sound of an airplane taking off echoes in the background, because today, Danny Carter didn't just board a flight. He learned that in a world full of rules and policies, sometimes all it takes is one person standing up to make things right. And that's a story worth telling. Want to hear more of this? Then click on the video on the right-hand side, which is even more insane.